Evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Lisa Live. I'm really pleased tonight to introduce Paul Roberts to you. Paul, if you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, well, good evening, everybody. I hope in these rather strange times we're all faring well. And isn't it some great news from Oxford University that it looks like they might have sorted a vaccine out, which is hopefully good news. So
amazing, yeah.
So to rather mundane matters, though, Lisa and I tonight are going to be discussing a fairly standard tax matter called a capital allowance. And I've been doing capital allowances now for about 20 years. Capital allowances themselves, though, some of you might be surprised to learn, have actually been around for over 100 years. So there's nothing new about capital allowances. In fact, the first ever recorded case that I'm aware of was one about whether a Glasgow dray horse actually qualified as being plant and machinery for the purpose of the trade.
Right.
Capital allowances are. And by the way, for the record, apparently it did. So,
just in case anyone's considering.
Having a dray horse, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it has to be a qualifying activity and a qualifying cost. So, but that's how it started all those years ago, and it's changed a number of times, which has made life quite difficult for many people because the legislation has changed quite a lot and the goalposts have moved. And there was one recently in 2014, which we will be talking about, which is absolutely vital you understand it. But one of the things I would like to just flag up before we start, Lisa, is that the thing that has never ceased to amaze me in all the years I've been doing it, two fairly significant points. And the first one is that capital allowances are quite often dramatically misunderstood. They're also very dramatically underestimated in the value and the quantum of the yield they can produce. And because of that, this is just a theory of mine, because they've been underestimated, they're quite often poo-pooed at the point of a transaction taking place with a commercial property. Both the buyer and the seller not appreciating the value that's being thrown around, simply sign them away, and it's only sometime later, when it's too late, that everybody realizes what they've done. And we'll be showing a couple of case histories, but by way of an example, just to give you a feel for this, if we were looking at a typical commercial property, let's say an office block, fairly routine, fairly standard office block, that was purchased for about £500,000. It would be quite routine for a specialist capital allowance researcher to find probably £100,000 to £120,000 worth of extra capital allowances over and above what had already been established by the routines that were in place. So when I say it's underestimated and it's quite often a big number, that hopefully will give you a feel for what kind of numbers are involved. It's quite chunky. I don't know whether that's a surprise or not. But,
it's a considerable amount of money, isn't it? Yeah.
It is not to be sniffed at all.
No.
Because the two main qualifying issues to be able to claim capital allowances is that you have to be a UK taxpayer and you have to have a qualifying commercial property doing a qualifying job. We'll go into the first slide if we may, Lisa, but before we do, one thing, everybody, we're talking about capital allowances. The capital allowance box is quite a big box with quite a bit of stuff in it, and we won't be going near most of it. We'll be looking in one of the dark corners of the box where we'll find something called PEFs, and PEFs are a shortened version of property embedded fixtures and features, which is more accurately going to describe what it is we're talking about. And the key word here is embedded. Key word to remember is embedded. Perhaps, as Boris Johnson would say, next slide, please.
Let's see if we can make this work.
Yeah.
There we go.
So before we go into much of a discussion, let's just clarify for everybody what exactly a capital allowance is, which this slide does. A capital allowance is a taxable benefit against expenditure on plant and machinery for the purpose of the trade. So, big question, sounds like a daft one, but this is a big question. What's plant and machinery? Now, you might not be surprised to know that very few people, including me on occasions, I have to say, are clear in what the difference is between plant and machinery, fixtures and fittings, chattels, and other such issues. They tend to merge a little bit. And that creates part of the problem regarding the claim of capital allowance. Because it's not always entirely clear to the people who are spending money on plant and machinery that qualifies, because they don't fully understand what is plant and machinery, they often don't know they're spending money on it. Therefore, they don't know enough to make a list of the items on which they've spent the money to then pass across to their accountant, who would then do the relevant claim to capital allowances. And at the end of the day, the accountants are doing a great job usually. There's not a problem with an accountant, but they can quite often only deal with the information they're given. So if money and work is done installing plant and machinery, and it's not created into an inventory or a list that's passed across to the accountant, it's quite often the case that they simply go unclaimed and sit in the balance sheet or in the accounts until somebody like myself perhaps comes along and says, hey, hang on a minute, there's stuff in there that we can get to grip. And you will perhaps see in a minute something that we've tried to explain why it is that it's not always picked up, because there is an elephant in the room, which we'll talk about in a minute. Before we go to that, so a capital allowance is taxable, a tax benefit against plant and machinery. What do we use it for? It's a very routine part of UK tax. Which brings me to another question, by the way. I'm quite often asked, if I claim my capital allowances, will I be in trouble with the Indian Revenue? Will they come looking for me? Have I got them excited about something? The quick answer is no. Capital allowances are a routine part of the legislation, and you should be claiming them. What they're there for? They're to encourage people to maintain standards in their offices and plants and warehouses. That's what they're designed to do.
Oh, okay.
And once you've spent this money, you can then use it to either reduce a company or an individual's tax bill. It's possible under the right circumstances to recover tax that's already been paid, so a refund can be generated. Clearly, if there aren't any taxable profits, then it's tricky to use capital allowances because you've nothing to set them against. But if you're in the process of perhaps selling property, then, and you're selling property with capital allowances in there that haven't been claimed, you can use it to enhance the sale by passing it across to the buyer, either by way of a consideration or, here you go, George, buy my property and I'll give you these. It's an option that can be useful if you know enough about it. It becomes a real-time balance sheet asset. That's worth thinking about as a tactic. Capital allowances can play a big part at the point where properties are changing hands, whether it be for the buyer or the seller.
Right, okay. So if you're buying commercial property, you need to be aware of this, basically.
Absolutely, you do. Absolutely. Yeah. Probably go to the next slide if we can, Lisa. So here's Sid. Here's Sid the elephant. The elephant's in the room. Because I did mention earlier on that that quite often people are spending money on capital allowances, and if the information doesn't go across the accountant or the facility, then those capital allowances aren't claimed. So you might find yourself asking, well, hang on a minute, how is it possible to actually spend money on a capital allowance that doesn't have enough information to give to an accountant to claim it? And the reality is, it happens all the time, regularly. And if we take the picture, for instance, you can see looks like a fairly razzy boardroom going on. And in there's a nice table and some chairs. And at some stage, somebody will have gone out and bought those. And having bought them, they'll then have been given an invoice by the supplier, which will have an amount of money on it, which will then be paid. Now that invoice becomes critical in this conversation because that invoice then becomes proof of expenditure. It's a piece of paper that goes across to an accountant. The accountant sees the piece of paper and says, yep, the table in its chairs, that constitutes plant and machinery for the purpose of the trade, and the capital allowances on it. It goes onto the right pile, ready to go. That single issue by both clients and accountants will quite genuinely say, and I've heard this so many times, I wish I had a pound for every time I'd heard it, quite often they'll say, don't worry, Paul, we're already doing it. And the fact is that they're doing some of it, and they're doing some of it very, very well. but what they don't realise is how much they're missing.
Right.
That's where we get to with this concept.
Okay. Fabulous. Next.
If we go to the next slide,
Yeah.
you pinched my line, didn't you? So let me just try and qualify what I've just said. This is my version of the building, a rather strange thing, but it depicts what I want to explain. So in a typical building, you'll have, as you can see to the left, the setting, the structure. The structure will be the roof, the walls, the floor, the guttering, and all the things that are the setting. And for capital allowance purposes, and for this conversation, we're not interested in that. Now then, with regard to the elephant in the room conversation, what we see in the middle is a lot of items that I would affectionately call movable items. That can be literally picked up and taken away. Now, those are the items that will have had an invoice and a piece of paper to prove they've been bought. And those are the items that invariably, again, we wouldn't be interested in because the capital allowance has already been claimed. But now look to the box on the right. And remember that word I said at the beginning, that word embedded. The items that we are looking for, usually that have been missed, are items that are screwed in, nailed in, plastered in, or bricked to the building, to the extent that they look like part of the building, and they are. But they also have functionality. If you look at that list, that simple list, if you took any of those items out of the building, something had stopped working, which means that they've got a function, which means they're plant of machinery, which means they qualify for capital allowances. But because they're embedded in the building and seen as part of the building, very rarely see an inventory that itemizes those points in a way that can be then passed to an accountant or to somebody else who can then deal with them for capital allowances. We call those the immovable items and the property embedded items, non-invoiced expenditure.
Right. Okay.
Does that make it a little clearer where we're going with this?
Yep, makes sense. Absolutely.
Okay. The two numbers at the bottom are there simply to demonstrate something I've already said, which is quantum and yield of the capital allowance claim can quite often be eye-watering. And the percentages that you can see demonstrate the percentages that I would find quite routinely in a claim, depending on what the building does for a living. So if you were to look at something like a high street retail environment, that would be quite low on capital allowances, to be fair. So you'd probably find maybe 5 or 6% of the money spent, whether it be on buying the building or on refurbishing it or whatever. If money's being spent, there'll be quite often a capital allowable element to it. But then you go to the other end of the line, where you go to something like maybe a hotel or an office or serviced accommodation or a restaurant, something where a lot of money has to be spent on ambience, lighting, heating, toilets, sanitation, health and safety. At that point, the level of expenditure to capital allowances can grow phenomenally. And the 65% isn't a made-up number. That represents, I did a hotel in Lincolnshire many, many years ago now, but I've used this as an example ever since, where the spend was, the original spend was 4.3 million, and we found 65% of that allowance claim that had been missed.
Wow.
65%.
Goodness.
And if we actually drill underneath those numbers, as an average, I would say typically 20 to 30% is probably kind of an average of the capital allowances that we find that the routine systems haven't been able to dig up.
Right.
That's the underestimation point I was trying to make a little earlier, which hopefully that makes it a little clearer now.
Absolutely. Next slide.
Yes, please.
Cool.
So the main reason for this slide, to be honest with you, is twofold, really. Clearly, the numbers down below, well, the text to the right illustrates that a building was engaged by a tenant and kitted out by a contractor. And the numbers were a leasehold property cost of £600,000 just under, and we identified a claim of 118,000, which is 20%, which is the kind of percentage I would expect. But one of the main reasons for this really is there is a popular misconception, Lisa, about what kind of position you have to be in to claim capital allowances. For instance, I've had it said to me quite regularly, well, I don't own the property. You don't have to own the property.
Right.
All you have to do is have to have spent money. If you've spent money on a qualifying asset, you're entitled to claim the capital allowances. The only thing that would happen on this particular kind of an example is that there's probably going to be two claims, because you'll find that the tenant who's done the fit out will have his own capital allowances to claim. And you might also find the landlord who's an investor will have a claim to be made on the building for the capital allowances that were in it when he bought it.
Right.
So there's a two-pronged attack here.
Mm.
And the other interesting thing about this kind of a scenario is that the line that refers to the fact a contractor was engaged to completely do a fit out. Now, I'm sure many of you will be aware of stage payments. And within the world of capital allowances, a stage payment is like a red flag. Stage payments are, for those of you who aren't sure, is for if a building is contracted to be refurbished or developed or extended or whatever, it's quite often going to take a bit of time, and a contractor will come in and say, okay, it's going to take me 4 months, and it's £200,000, so it's going to be £50,000 a month until the job. That's the stage payment. The surveyor will go in at the end of the month, and he will confirm that the relevant work has been done. And a piece of paper called a stage payment will be handed to the owner of the building and asked to pay that month's instalment.
Yeah.
Stage payments are absolutely brilliant at telling you absolutely nothing. In that stage, whatever it is, it's likely that work will have been done to install capital allowable assets. But all the stage payment usually says is how much you've got to pay. So it could be that the heating's been installed or the sanitation's been installed, but the stage payment, very rarely, if any, I don't think I've ever seen it, will actually put any detail to it. So the piece of paper called the stage payment goes to the accountant looks at it and says, yep, that's freehold improvement or leasehold improvement, whatever it is. It goes quite rightly into the balance sheet. But what happened is the detail that's gone into that stage payment in terms of capital allowances is hidden. So a stage payment is quite often a common way that capital allowances are missed because there isn't enough detail in that document.
I see. So it's not a problem with the stage payments; it's the problem with the detail in the invoicing, right?
Absolutely, and that is a reasonable observation, Lisa, to cover the majority of occasions where a capital allowance is missed. The level of detail simply hasn't been supplied to make it doable. With the best will in the world, most builders and contractors will probably prefer not to be too detailed in both the costings because of their profit margins. So the level of detail, unless you're very insistent, coming from a contractor or a builder, will be limited.
Right.
Which is why one of the things we have to do when we undertake this kind of work is we have to go into the building and survey it room by room by room, and create this inventory that hitherto hasn't existed, so that we know exactly what's in there, we can get it valued, and when we then deliver the piece of paper to HMRC, we can say, we know what we've got, we know what's being claimed, this is what's outstanding.
Right, that makes sense.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, again, really just by way of an example, fairly mundane office block, acquired for just over £1 million in 2005, with a claim of 291,000. Again, 27%. That number pops up quite a lot. Look at the items on the right-hand side. These, I'm hoping, have started to give you a real feel for where the outstanding CAs are often sitting. They're embedded in the building, and that's why they're missed. We take them all for granted. We open fire doors, but if there wasn't a fire door there, we wouldn't be able to go in that office. The fire people would say it's not safe. If there isn't a non-slip floor on a bathroom or a toilet, health and safety might go in and say, sorry, you can't use this toilet because you might slip and break your ankle. Things like communication. How would any business survive if it didn't have telephones and computer links and all those things? Therefore, they're a functioning item, which is standard. And when you actually get, one of the examples I do like to use is if you look at a telephone socket, how much is a telephone socket? 90p, a pound, whatever it is, who knows? But it's not just that telephone socket that qualifies here. What about fitting it? What about the wiring that goes from the telephone socket back to wherever it goes? All of that would be included in a capital allowance claim.
Okay, so it's the physical labour to fit it as well.
Absolutely. Everything that goes in making it function is a qualifying expenditure.
Right.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. If nothing else is remembered from tonight, and hopefully things will be, it would be important to remember that in 2014, some new legislation came into play. Clearly it's not new anymore, even though I still refer to it as the new legislation. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail, Lisa, if you don't mind, because like all legislation, it's full of small print and takes a bit of time to cover. The important thing to note is that if you're buying or selling a building in the period after 2014, if you don't deal with the capital allowance position correctly in the contract in a way that's predetermined by HMRC rules, the capital allowances on that building will be lost forever and ever and ever. Right. So, as a purchaser, it's absolutely vital that if you're acquisitive, you do make sure that the capital allowance position is explored and documented where it needs to be. Because if you don't, there could be who knows how many hundreds of thousands of pounds sitting in there, but you won't be able to get at it. And the sooner you let somebody like me know that you're perhaps having the conversation, the sooner we can start to get into the kind of detail and small print that the contract needs to have to be able to do what it needs to do.
Right, okay.
Very important, that, Lisa, really. I'm coming across now, because this happened in 2014, this particular piece of work has to be done either at the point of the transaction or within 2 years. So now we're past 2016, so if the work's not been done and the CAs have been lost, I've had a number of conversations now with clients who I've had to say, I'm sorry, you can't do it now, you're out of time. And that creates problems of all sorts.
Yeah. So it's really key that you understand it and realise.
Very.
Yeah.
Very key. Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely.
So that in essence is the concept in its purest form. I don't know where you want to go from here, really.
We'll just put this one up quickly, shall we? We were going to.
Oh yes, sorry, yes.
And then we'll go back to.
Yeah. Well, this is two things for this, really. One, it's just showing that my particular team is full of people who can provide the kind of advice that is watertight and good quality advice. We've got chartered accountants and surveyors, and we even have an ex-HMRC inspector who was responsible for capital allowances in the southwest. So that's, I hope it is a reasonably good point in terms of what we are, but what it really also shows you is the level of knowledge and expertise you do need to have if you're going to put a capital allowance claim in that will hold water at the point where it's delivered to HMRC. Not just a case of counting the telephone points, not just a case of valuing them, it's not just a case of making sure the tax position is created. It's a combination of all those things. They all have to be glued together to make it work.
Of course. I'm going to stop the screen share now, shall I? And we'll carry on chatting.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. So that shows the really significant thing if you're purchasing a commercial building. Obviously, the group of people listening and watching are principally looking at it from an investing in supported living point of view. So if people are buying commercial buildings to convert for supported living, that's where we need to kind of think about how that impacts now. And I know there's quite a few nuances that people need to be aware of, aren't there, Paul?
There are, and the first one, before we get into the slightly complicated one, is that if, as an example, you're buying a property, let's say a pub, which is vacant at the point you purchase it, and you intend to convert into supported, assisted or serviced accommodation, it's important to get ducks in a row in this kind of a procedure. and the ducks in the row would also create problems that can't overcome. For instance, if you buy a building that's vacant at the point you buy it, it's not a qualifying activity. Therefore, whatever the quantum of the capital allowances that are in there, it's not qualifying. Therefore, they can't be got at.
So if we use the example of the social club that I've recently I've purchased in November that we're converting to flats, yeah. It was still licensed premises. It still has a license, but it isn't being used. The business wasn't there. They'd gone bankrupt. So that then means that it isn't a qualifying activity when we purchased it. Is that right?
Yeah. It's going to have qualifying assets in it, but it's not a qualifying activity. Therefore,
so what's the difference between those, Paul? Just
the qualifying asset would be the radiator.
Yeah.
The qualifying activity would be trading as a pub.
Right. Okay.
Both those things need to be in place for a successful claim to be made to HMRC.
So then, therefore, because we bought it as it wasn't actually a qualifying activity, we've lost all of those potential claims in that.
Well, in actual fact, you never had them.
No.
Because of the circumstances you bought it under. And this is where some of this might be completely impossible for many of the group, because one of the things to try and do wherever you can would be maybe to take property that is still functioning, or perhaps on acquisition make it function as in some commercial activity or form for a while. Mm-hmm. Please don't ask me what a while means, because I don't know the answer to that, because it's different every time I ask of the revenue what they want. It can be, well, it could be anything depending on the attitude of the inspector who's dealing with the case, to be honest with you. Right. The capital allowance legislation has a number of very grey areas in it, because it has to have them, because circumstances can change depending on what's going on at the time. But the point is that if it can be made into a qualifying activity for a period of time, then that maybe creates the opportunity to claim the capital allowances from the building, or then it's converted into an activity that might not be qualifying.
Right.
So if you were taking a pub and converting it into pure flats, that's converting a commercial property into residential. Residential, for the purpose of capital allowances, don't qualify. The revenue take the view, once you walk through the front door of somebody's residence, it's no longer a commercial property, therefore there are no capital allowances available.
Right.
But one of the things, again, which isn't always going to be possible, is to strip the capital allowances out of the building before you even apply for planning permission, because once you apply for planning permission, you've shown intent.
Okay.
So this is what I mean about the ducks in a row.
And really understanding the process so that you can maximise those benefits.
And as I said earlier on, to some, and possibly to many, the practicalities of doing what I'm suggesting just might not be real. But I think if there was an understanding of what's necessary, when the opportunity does present itself, you know what can happen maybe. But the real clue is to talk to somebody who's capable in the world of capital allowances, and then they'll guide you through it bit by bit, including perhaps sometimes looking at the small print of some of the contracts between providers and healthcare people to make sure that all the small print's right. That also is another duck that needs to be in a row.
We were talking about that, weren't we, about when the property is handed over to a provider and making sure that lease is exactly, the wording is as good as it can be. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that? Anything else you think people?
Yes, and I'm sorry, it will have to be a little vague, because what I need to, and people like me would need to be able to see, is what circumstances in small print are being described at the time, so that we can take a view as to whether it was good enough to get the building into the right place. And if time allowed us to, we might want to say we need to change that bit of small print to read something else which will make it qualify.
And so, what kinds of things would, you were talking about control and access to the building when we were chatting earlier, weren't you?
Yeah. So as for instance, if let's say you bought your social club and you were converting it into a serviced accommodation, you as the owner of the building would spend the money refurbishing it and doing what was necessary, which would include putting plant and machinery into it, which would be allowances. If you were then continuing to use it as an investor, then the capital allowance claim would be fine for you, because you bought the building, you've spent money, and it's ticking all the boxes. If, however, you were going to maybe lease it on to another party who was going to use it for his or their own purpose, you potentially at that point might have spent the money, but you no longer have a qualifying activity because you've passed it to somebody else.
Right.
So what we then have to do is make sure that the terms of the agreement meant that the new person would be able to, one, get the capital allowances that you've installed, because that actually can be done, and not a lot of people know that. You could actually pass your capital allowances across in the deal if you wanted, maybe selling them on, maybe.
Okay.
It's a section 183, if I remember rightly. Then the new owner will then similarly have to ensure that he was ticking the box to ensure he was a qualifying activity.
Right.
And that concept goes all the way down the chain, because I know I do speak to people who have a property investor who's bought it, he then passes it to a care provider, they then send it to a health supporter, and there's a bit of a chain. And all that chain has to be looked at very carefully to make sure everything's right.
So if I've got this right from what you're saying, there isn't basically a clear cut, this is how to do it. It varies from situation to situation, property and lease to lease. There are so many variations within it. Is that right?
There can be variations, but I guess the common denominators are that for instance, if you have, say, a bungalow with a family living in it for whom no services are being provided, it's their home, they've got the key, nobody can go in and whenever they want, that would be the residence. Now, they might be on some sort of a benefit or a supported living scheme, but the circumstances surrounding the property mean it's their residence, therefore it couldn't be got to.
Right.
However, if that same family were having regular care, there was food being provided, there were groups of people who were quite often going in to make sure they were all right and counselling them, and in many ways they weren't quite the master of their own destiny, then that might put that building into a different place.
Right. Okay. So even though that's a residential building, it could be classed as something, if we're talking about a bungalow. Yeah. If
the circumstances are right, it isn't out of the question. It gets tricky, Lisa. There are some areas of capital allowances where it gets tricky. But that's the nature of the beast.
It is, and very much with supported living, I feel like I say this all the time, it's like, well, there isn't one straight answer for anything in supported living, and this is just another situation where that's the case, it seems, you know.
Yeah, well, another example, which I think you mentioned might be worth covering, were HMOs.
Yeah, absolutely, because quite a lot of people have an HMO kind of set up for supported living, so talk us through how that works.
Well, HMOs, homes of multiple occupants, they do have a little bit of form in that the capital allowance position on an HMO is, again, not clear, and in the past it has been abused a little, to the point where HMRC are a little cautious about some claims and perhaps look at them a little bit harder. When I say abused, let me give you an example, which obviously it's a little bizarre, but it will explains the point. You might have a landlord with a portfolio of residential properties, all of which are being charged, have a rental income to them, and it's his business. It is a business. You'd think at that point it would become a commercial property. It doesn't. What you actually have is a rented property that is somebody's residence. What's happened in the past is that you might have a couple living in it, Jack and Jill. What will have happened is the claimant, the landlord, will have said, well, Jack lives in bedroom 1, Jill lives in bedroom 2. Those bedrooms are their residences. Everywhere else is a public area, because the truth of an HMO is that you can claim on public areas, not areas that would be considered to be somebody's residence. So saying Jack and Jill have got their own bedrooms, which are their residences, and everything else is public, was the way in which a claim was made, which isn't correct. Because revenue would say, hold on a minute, Jack and Jill, to make a home need to have a toilet. They need to have a kitchen. They need to have a living room. They need to have a bathroom. So those are integral to a person's residence and can't be considered public areas. So that takes you. So that's where it's been abused somewhat, and
Right.
that takes you into where it can be worked for legal purposes, which is where you have an HMO, perhaps probably with 5 or 6 occupants. So it's a big enough building to mean that it's got public areas, because it's the public areas where the claims can be made: corridors, boiler rooms, laundrettes, outside facilities, all the things which are literally available to the public to get at them.
Right.
That's where the claim for an HMO is available.
So it wouldn't be the toilets, the kitchens, the communal space necessarily. It's the space it's the public space.
Yes.
Yeah.
The corridors and the boiler room and the laundrettes are areas where everybody can go to. They're not considered one person's, therefore everybody can use them, and that's where the claim becomes viable. And the work that goes into supporting an HMO from our part is quite significant now, because we're aware of what we might come up against. So we don't like to fail, so the level of due diligence has to be quite high.
Okay, and that's because there's been poor precedents previously that
There's been 1 or 2 dodgy bits gone on, yeah.
Okay, right, fine. Is there anything else with HMOs and supported living to be aware of? It's just that what's classed as.
I think the general comment I would make about HMOs, supported living, assisted living, serviced accommodation, is just be aware that there is a little bit more to be, a few more boxes to be ticked than if we were just looking at, for instance, a pub or a hotel or an office block. They're almost straightforward. There's not a lot of contentious about them. We just have to make sure what's in there. It's not being claimed already. How much is it worth? Here's the claim, Mr. Inspector. The serviced accommodation is different.
So if you're buying a commercial building and you were keeping it for that same commercial purpose, like that pub, you were buying it, you were going to keep running it as a pub, that's more straightforward.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Nice and easy, that.
We don't like to make life easy for you, Paul. We like to give you challenges.
Yeah. Not too many.
That's really helpful. Thank you for kind of going through that. I know there's a couple of questions that people have put into the group. Are you happy to answer a couple of questions?
Yeah.
Well, let's have a see what people are saying. For capital allowances purposes, which supported living properties are deemed as commercial in order to claim?
I think we've kind of covered that question, haven't we? In that we'd have to look at the individual circumstances of the building, how the small print is written and how it's being used to be able to determine that. That's one of those not clear questions without a bit more detail to understand things.
If you have a building that's being, and I think the person who's asking this might have this sort of building, so a building that's got several uses, so maybe residential, hostel type rooms upstairs and more office, say clinical type rooms on the ground floor. If it's that sort of situation, you've got a split within one building, how does that work?
That which is clearly defined as a commercial property without the complications that we talked about would represent a fairly straightforward claim.
Okay, perfect. So the commercial bits that are still being used as commercial bits you can claim for parts of buildings in that situation.
Yes.
Perfect. Can capital allowances be claimed on HMOs? I think we've kind of covered that, haven't we?
Yes, if the boxes are ticked.
Yeah. Someone's saying, sorry, I joined a little bit late. You might have mentioned it already, but can you claim capital allowances on items bought before you registered the business if you transfer them in when you start it up as pre-startup costs?
That's more of an accounting question, but my understanding, although please whoever's asking the question check it, my understanding is yes, if you put something in there that has since become used for capital allowable purposes, then the capital allowances can be claimed.
Even if it was before your business started?
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure about that. It's probably a question I would want to check myself, but I think that would be okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing does spring to mind, by the way, which I did mention that's worth bringing to the party here. Remember we talked about the new legislation?
Mm.
Well, The new legislation only applies to transactions going forward from 2014. And the reason I mention that is that if there's anybody in your group who's had a building that they bought prior to 2014, then the old rule, and they still own it, the old rules apply. And
Right.
the old rules say that there's no time bar on how far back we can go to establish a claim.
Okay.
No time bar at all.
Wow. So if you've had that building and the building was built 50, 60 years ago, potentially, you could be claiming back from
The oldest building I've ever claimed on was, in fact, do you remember Bulmers Cider?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the Bulmers family had a property in Scotland built in 1697 or something like that, which was converted into a hunting and fishing lodge. And we did the claim on that building, which was built in the 1600s. We were claiming for cannons on the turrets and weather vanes and all sorts of things, because they were contributing ambience to its new activity.
Right. Okay.
Well,
brilliant. Okay. What percentage of commercial properties on average will have already had the capital allowances claimed?
well, I can only answer this really in one way, because I wouldn't be able to give you a very mathematically clear and precise answer. But in the 20 years I've been doing this, I can count on one hand how many times I've come across a property that has been completely dealt with. So the answer to the question is a very high proportion of buildings will still have outstanding capital allowances that are unclaimed in them. And it's worth, in the way of things, hundreds of thousands of millions of pounds. It's a huge amount of money. I've just done a claim on a tourist resort in the southwest that was had a balance sheet value of 34 million, and we found 17 million pounds that hadn't been claimed.
Wow.
Staggering. Although sometimes it almost sounds too good to be true. But that's what it is.
So in your experience, it's a massive, the majority of buildings haven't had them fully explored.
The question I always ask somebody, because I have to deal with this all of the time, the question I ask somebody who says, I've already done it, is to say, I know you will have done, how long did the survey take? Now that usually gets a blank look because they won't have had a survey. And I know that unless they've had a survey to bring out the detail that we need, I'm highly unlikely to done the claim to capital allowances in all of its glory.
Right, okay. So
and to be fair, that usually drives it home to the person I'm talking to as well. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so this is the same. Someone else is asking. I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. We're buying an empty commercial building and have been told we can claim a capital allowance as a percentage of the purchase price.
It's empty?
Yeah.
No, if it's vacant as you buy it, no, you can't.
No.
What do you intend to do with the building going forward?
I think
that's probably the key question.
Yeah. It's definitely supported living. I'm not sure which building that is, because I think, it might be worth her getting in touch with you perhaps and just clarifying. Yes,
please do. Please get in touch and we'll talk it through. But the cold fact will be, if it's vacant right now, it's not a qualifying activity anymore.
No. And are you happy? I think that's all the questions I think everyone's come up with for you, looking at them. So thank you. For people to contact you, because I know you're not really on Facebook, are you, Paul? Is it better if I drop your email address into the comments? Would that be the best way for people to contact you?
Absolutely, happy to do that. And then we have a very, very simple, what we call appraisal form. Not difficult to fill in. That would just give me, we'd send one of those that would come back with a level of detail that would simply give me a bit of an understanding, and then we'd have a quick call and very quickly we'd get to the point of saying, yes, it's a go, or no, it's not.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you ever so much. That's been really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. Glad to have helped. Thank you.